Kevin Harrison of the Historical Crime Section, and he's going to just speak to you here for a couple minutes, give you sort of an overview, and then we'll open it up to questions.
Thank you. Afternoon, and thank you for coming today. I'm Detective Harrison with the Edmonton Police Service Historical Crime Section. We brought you here today to speak about the recent conclusion of a historical sexual assault case. As outlined in our media release, we recently charged a 65-year-old man in relation to an investigation from 1981. On July 9th of that year, in the early morning hours, a 15-year-old female was walking home across a school field in northeast Edmonton when she was grabbed, dragged to a nearby area, threatened, and sexually assaulted by a male. The suspect then reportedly left on foot, leaving the 15-year-old alone and obviously traumatized. The suspect and the female were not known to one another, and the police investigation at that time did not identify the suspect. In February 2018, the investigation was reassigned to our Historical Crime Section, and exhibits from the file were submitted to the RCMP lab for analysis. A DNA profile of the male suspect was subsequently developed and submitted to the National DNA Databank, but there was no match. In 2021, our team decided to utilize the technique of investigative genetic genealogy, which compared the crime scene DNA sample with profiles in publicly accessible commercial DNA databases. Through this comparison, and by working with an investigative genetic genealogist, investigators were able to combine information about relatives of the suspect with other existing evidence to identify a now 65-year-old male. In May of this year, the RCMP lab confirmed that lawfully obtained DNA from the suspect matched the DNA profile developed from exhibits of the crime. On Thursday, October 13th, 2022, with the assistance of the local RCMP, we arrested Guy Griffard of Kelvington, Saskatchewan. Griffard has since been charged with rape and acts of gross indecency as defined in the 1981 Criminal Code. Historical investigations such as this are often unique and at times incredibly challenging, especially when we are dealing with an investigative process from 40 years ago. Given these complex factors, our team is grateful when our efforts result in the conclusion of an investigation, and our hope is that this arrest will provide some closure for the survivor of this traumatic attack after all these years. Of course, we also recognize how such news can be triggering to the many survivors still waiting for a similar conclusion to their own investigation. For this reason, the EPS continues to prioritize the review of historical sexual assault files, a process that was initiated in 2016 and resulted in the expansion of the Historical Crime Section in 2018. We are continuously researching new and innovative ways to solve historical crimes by using techniques like investigative genetic genealogy, which has been used by other police agencies in North America to solve similar historical crimes. That being said, we also understand that the use of new technologies may leave people with several questions. As it relates to investigative genetic genealogy, we always use the National DNA Databank first to seek out any matches between a suspect DNA profile to known offenders or crime scenes. In addition, investigative genetic genealogy is only used when all other investigative steps have been exhausted. Furthermore, I'd like to emphasize that when we do collect DNA from a suspect or any other person involved, we do so lawfully and when we have an investigative reason for doing so. We do not randomly submit DNA profiles for comparison within publicly accessible DNA databases. The use of this technology and the ability for law enforcement to search these publicly accessible DNA databases is strictly reserved for cases such as homicides, sexual assaults, and other serious violent crimes. I'm now happy to take any questions.
Harrison, just, obviously the victim and their family, I assume you told them, you alluded to closures. What was the reaction from the survivor and or their family when you told them the news of this arrest?
In one word, happy. Very happy that she was not forgotten and that we were able to make an arrest in this case.
And was the actual arrest made in Saskatchewan?
Yes.
And I guess, is there any reason to believe that this individual may have committed other crimes over the years, and will you look at that?
Unfortunately, I'm not prepared to speak to that at this moment.
Are you able to say whether the person now facing charges was a resident of Saskatchewan in 1981, or were they a resident of Edmonton for a time?
We believe, based on our investigation, he was a resident of Edmonton at that time.
Can you say whether he was living in the same neighborhood, even though you're alleging that the victim and the perpetrator didn't know each other?
Unfortunately, I can't go into those details at this time.
For residents of Northeast Edmonton, or all residents for that matter, and I don't know how much you've looked back, but I think we looked through our archives and couldn't necessarily find record of this happening. Was this a high-profile story at the time, or was this sort of kept within the family?
That's a good question, and I'm not sure that I can answer that. I also probably like yourselves, have checked to see if there was media releases at the time. I don't have that answer for you, so I'm speculating.
And can you, in layman's terms, maybe just go through how the genetics identification process works, where if you don't come up with that hit in the national database in 2018, how you turn to that family linkage,
Sure.
and how that helped crack the case, so to speak?
Sure. So I think we want to be very clear that the DNA profiles that are used for direct comparisons within the RCMP lab and the National DNA Data Bank are a different type of DNA profile that is developed and generated by these direct-to-consumer profiles. So it's two different types of profiles. When exhibits or a DNA sample is sent to the private labs in the US, a profile is developed. They return, once that DNA profile is developed, they are uploaded into certain databases. That then generates a list of genetic matches for investigators and the genetic genealogists to review, which allows us to start building a family tree. And oftentimes, the way I've had it best described to me is they work from a suspect DNA profile up the family tree to a most recent common ancestor, and then work their way back down to a putative or possible suspect. And then other investigative steps are taken to ensure that that suspect is the right age, lives in the right area, matches the description. But ultimately the key is this is an investigative technique or tool. We are obligated then to go out and seek lawful DNA from the suspect that is profiled as per the RCMP lab and compared to the suspect profile to confirm a match. So this tool, this investigative genetic genealogy tool, gives us a lead, which then drives us to getting lawful DNA from a suspect and getting a confirmed match.
Is that as simple as showing up at their doorstep and swabbing their throat, or what does that look like?
I guess I would have to say that police have various techniques we use to do that. I'm not prepared to get into those today. That is something maybe we could follow up with later.
Can you say, maybe you mentioned it in your opening remarks, the person facing charges now, any other criminal record that you know of?
I can't disclose that at this time.
Okay. Can you say what his reaction was?
No, sorry.
Can you say where this stands in the sort of the history of the EPS and how far back you've been able to get a DNA match in historic cases? How many of these is this one of the oldest? What can you say?
Well, I would say that for us, this is the first time we have laid criminal charges based on using the investigative genetic genealogy technique. As far as a confirmed laying charges and how far back that goes, I'd have to do some research and get back to you on that one. But this is a long time ago. You know, in the early 80s, there was no consideration to DNA. So when officers attended scenes, they didn't necessarily seize exhibits with that in consideration.
What does this arrest say to victims of historic assaults such as this, and transversely also to the people who allegedly believe they've gotten away with it?
Good question. Well, number one, I think it's important to note that the survivors of these types of attacks, whether it's or families of homicide victims or survivors of sexual assaults, that they are not forgotten, that our office and the EPS are continually researching new techniques and ways to, explore evidence and try to come to some conclusion and identify suspects and make arrests for sure. When it comes to people who have committed these crimes, I truly believe that some of these people believe they've gotten away with it, and, they need to know that we haven't forgotten them either.
So this is the first time you've used this technology. I'm assuming that you've used it before and maybe it hasn't worked, or you folks are hopeful that this will answer questions in a number of other historic cases. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, so we have used investigative genetic genealogy before. We are currently using it in a number of other active investigations. It has led to the identity of a suspect in another ongoing investigation. So it's being used at various levels for several different types of crimes.
Can you say which genealogy database you used in this case?
So there are only two publicly accessible DNA databases that allow law enforcement to search. That is GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA. And both of their websites and terms of services guide law enforcement searches, and I would direct you to those to review those, but those are the only two that allow law enforcement to search suspect DNA or look for matches of suspect DNA.
Can you say just a couple little housekeeping items, like a field in northeast Edmonton? Can you give us the nearest cross street of this?
Yeah, 121 Avenue and 46th Street would be the closest cross streets.
Now, what are the exact charges against this suspect?
Rape and gross indecency.
And are they being held in custody? Are they released? Are they expected to appear in court here? What is some of
They are released. He has been released, and there is a court date set for December.
Here in Edmonton, or?
Yes.
Can you tell us the time of day that the alleged act took place?
I won't get into the exact time, but I can tell you it was in the early morning hours.
What criteria do police use to open up old cases?
Well, I think that's a pretty generic question, but so there are different fields within our historical crime section. That includes historic homicide, historic sexual assaults, and historic missing persons. There was a larger review done of the historic sexual assaults by various investigators done in sexual assault section and the historic crime section over the years, identifying which cases needed to be looked at again, which ones had potential exhibits that needed to be reviewed. That was done before my time. However, that review is ongoing, and we're always looking at the files again if new technology, new techniques, and new standards for DNA arise.
Can you give us any details on what the exhibits were and whether, is this like the TV shows where they're sitting in a box on a shelf for decades and you pull them out when you've identified something you'd like to look at again?
Yeah, I'm sorry, and I can't get into those specifics at this time.
Sorry, did you say he's continuing to be remanded?
No, he was released. Yeah.
Any other questions? All right, great.
Brought back here, though?
The court date is scheduled for Edmonton.
Great.
I might Might try to think of another question so we can get you to stand there a little longer. Sure. The family, I guess the identification, it's traced through a family tree using these websites. Does that mean a family member of the suspect or the accused here at some point uploaded their own information to one of these websites, or how does that work?
So when the investigative genetic genealogist and the investigative team start working through the family tree, the list of genetic matches that comes back can be anywhere from a parental child level of DNA match, right? You and your mother or you and your father share a certain level of DNA, and that's quite a high level, right? Because we take half of our DNA from our mom and half from our dad, versus a level of DNA that would be shared between fourth, fifth, sixth cousins, right? So this technology can reveal matches as far away as fifth and sixth generations away. So to come back to your question, when we look at those matches and you talk about a family member that would have potentially uploaded their DNA, that person could be so distantly related to our suspect, they have no idea they're in their family, right?
And on that DNA collection, is that something the suspect is aware of? I guess when you say you legally obtain it, is the suspect aware of the fact you obtain it?
I think I have to come back to my answer before. There are various ways that law enforcement can collect DNA from suspects lawfully. Sometimes they're aware and sometimes they're not.
I think he's asking if you followed him to a fast food joint or something.
I can't confirm details in this investigation, so.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys for coming out today.
Thank you.